the pool is acting as more of just a coordinator, and the miners themselves have more control over what Bitcoin block they're building, making sure that's a Bitcoin block that's building on the canonical Bitcoin chain, having some control over what transactions go into that block, more power back to the individual miners, and make it harder for the pool to do things that are either malicious towards the Bitcoin protocol or malicious towards the miners on their pool. Those three Bitcoin miners you'd be holding at gunpoint would be, the three Bitcoin pools, presumably. And so the miners on those pools would migrate somewhere else. Okay, awesome. Great to meet you. And we definitely have some interesting intersections with Bitcoin mining, Bitcoin security. So yeah, happy to chat. Yeah, for sure. So I got into Bitcoin back in late 2011, early 2012. More as just a spectator initially. I thought the tech was really interesting. I've always been interested in, cybersecurity and cryptography. And so Bitcoin was just kind of a natural fit to a lot of my interests. And then in 2013, 2014, I did some work on making like GPU miners for various coins. Tried to get more into, really found the consensus protocol side of it interesting, but kind of danced around the edges. And then in 2014, 2015, started to get more into consensus protocol design. And so I did a project we started in 2015, but really got off the ground in 2016, where we created the proof of proof protocol, which is a consensus protocol that enables any blockchain to inherit Bitcoin security in a completely decentralized and permissionless way. And then we launched that as a project in 2019. And for a variety of reasons, we had trouble getting adoption. The tech ended up being harder to build than we expected back then, and we were all very new and trying to figure things out. And the market also kind of moved from proof of work, interest in proof of work, into more of a focus on proof of stake and, quote unquote, green consensus protocols and whatnot. And then back in about 2 years ago, I started working on this project, Hemi, which was kind of a way we're doing a lot of things, but one of them was to take that technology that we had started developing a long time ago and rework it in a way that's applicable to the modern blockchain ecosystem. So being able to use that Bitcoin security inheritance protocol proof of proof in a way that intersects with Ethereum L2s, the current interoperability landscape. And yeah, so that's kind of my background. I've been doing consensus protocol stuff for almost 10 years now, since we originally started working on POP. And yeah, I think that's the probably all the interesting bits of my background.
Well done. That's some great stuff. So thanks for the contribution for sure. So I think you're a very good person to ask this first question, which I have. So I have listed a bunch of questions which have been on my mind, let's say, for the last month or two. So I used to have this opinion that Bitcoin is more or less not at risk of failure, or if it has a catastrophic bug as such. But I never actually thought there was a threat from inside the network that can get the network. And I was listening to Bitcoin Mechanic speak, and he was raising loopholes that I don't really understand. So I wanted to find an expert to speak to and ask these questions. And it sort of made me think like, okay, so is Bitcoin more vulnerable than I thought? And if so, let me find out more about it. So my first question is basically angled at what do you see the most significant vulnerabilities today in Bitcoin's network?
That's a good question. Actually, a little bit of a funny background. So one of my co-founders in this project, Jeff Garzik, he was, I think, the third Bitcoin core developer. So Satoshi, then Gavin Andreessen, then Jeff Garzik working on the Bitcoin core code back in 2010. And Jeff Garzik, he actually found the first bug, the first like major protocol bug in Bitcoin, which was an underflow attack that basically allowed people to mint more than the 21 million Bitcoin limit. And obviously it was the early days of Bitcoin, so that was easy to patch. But there's always risk of stuff like that. There could always be a protocol bug. Bitcoin by far is the most secure blockchain for three main reasons. The first being, obviously, it's proof of work. The amount of proof of work that it's amassed is absolutely insane. And, theoretically, could a state actor take over TSMC and print, enough ASICs to 51% attack the network? Theoretically, yes, but, I think the reality is Bitcoin, if you're going to choose a cryptocurrency to use and trust with, large amounts of money, Bitcoin is definitely the place to do it from a 51% attack reorganization perspective. And so that's why we're so interested in using it, reusing that proof of work to secure other chains. The second area is, of course, there being protocol vulnerabilities, like something actually wrong with the code itself. But Bitcoin is such a slow-moving protocol that, and there's so much scrutiny put on any changes to the Bitcoin code that is very unlikely, and definitely more unlikely on Bitcoin than other networks that have more of a, move fast and break things attitude. And, there's pros and cons to each. We've seen Bitcoin's, slow development pace basically give up market share to blockchains that could do things that Bitcoin can't. And so it's definitely a trade-off. But from a security perspective, the fact that the last major Bitcoin upgrade, Taproot took several years and lots of arguing to get implemented, and a lot of other proposals that are even relatively conservative haven't been able to be incorporated into the protocol, gives everyone using it pretty good confidence that, the Bitcoin that they have in their cold wallet from 10 years ago is always going to be accessible,
Yes.
and there's not going to be some weird bug. And then the third is, and this is something that is really only started to become relevant recently, is the risk that things building on top of Bitcoin pose to the Bitcoin protocol. And so even though Bitcoin itself has all this security and the protocol doesn't change, people are now building stuff on top of Bitcoin that can change the Bitcoin incentive system. And so one example of that is when you look at Bitcoin L2s, depending on how they're designed, they can actually create MEV vulnerabilities on Bitcoin that create economic incentives for bad actors, even with less than 51% of the network hash rate, to attempt to do small range reorgs to try to front run certain transactions. So that's kind of another angle that's evolving, and definitely interesting, but that could be a whole hour conversation in itself.
To be honest, I've angled the entire conversation on this. So my next follow-up to this is, what's your opinion currently on the state of mining pools? And practically speaking, do you think Satoshi knew that, let's say, the act of mining will not be solo for long, and it will be a pool of, let's say, miners who are just contributing hashing power, but ultimately the power is basically going to these massive pools now, and they have huge control over the network, as per I'm seeing, like Antminer and Antpool and these guys. So what's your opinion on that? Do you think it's sustainable to keep on going with the mining pools like this? Or is there a risk that they can pose a threat to the decentralized part of Bitcoin?
It's a good question. I'd say I don't think the current pool landscape is that big of a risk, but it is something that is relevant. You have to consider. I don't have exact numbers in front of me, but Bitcoin mining right now, as far as what number of pools have above 10 or 15 or 20% hash rate, has been pretty constant for the last couple of years, and may have even, the distribution I think has even gotten a little bit better. There was a time where one of the pools was, I think, approaching, and don't quote me on this, but like 35 or 40% of the network hash rate. And at the moment, it looks like the highest pool right now is at 31%. So it's definitely a concern. I think people, when they look at proof of stake consensus protocols, they make the argument that attacking the proof of stake protocol would be like burning down your mining farm, because theoretically your stake would be slashed if you didn't attack on the protocol. And I think similar thinking also applies to Bitcoin, where you have these, Bitcoin miners can really only be used for Bitcoin mining, at least in the volume that they exist in the world. And so people going and doing an attack on Bitcoin, it would take multiple pools working together, and they would be basically, shooting the entire
I
Bitcoin
know.
market in the foot by doing that. So it's kind of similar to proof of stake in a way that people don't really realize, where the miners, if they were to do an attack on the protocol, they are kind of burning down their mining farms, similar to proof of stake in a way, because those miners are not going to be worth as much if Bitcoin actually does get attacked. And I think there's a lot of incentives for decentralizing, pool share to make sure nobody controls enough to perform any, attacks of too large of a magnitude. And there is also some development in pool technologies that are trying to decentralize parts of the pool experience. And so, way back in the day, you had the peer-to-pool, which was a interesting way of allowing people to pool hash rate together, but do it in a semi-decentralized way. And that approach has kind of fallen off, but there's now new developments in the space for mining pools that give the miners control over the block template, and other parts of the block creation process that historically has been done kind of opaquely by the pools, and using the older protocols would give them more power. So it's interesting. It's something
So,
that's going to actively develop.
so these are safeguards against sort of against the 51% attack risk.
Yeah, the improvement in pool technology is kind of a natural. It's a way for pools to decentralize themselves, but I think there's a market pressure that's starting to demand that pools start using protocols that give more power to the individual miners on them. And so it's a demand from the miners to get the pools to some extent disintermediate themselves. But at the end of the day, it is still a centralized pool controlling the hash rate in some way, but there's
Yeah,
things you can do
exactly.
that give the power kind of back to the miners through the pool. And so like the miners would never build on a block that, for example, could perform a reorganization, because they know the block that they're building on top of, they have that transparency, and they're building, block template locally based on the current canonical state of Bitcoin that they know. So not a perfect solution, but I think things are moving in the right direction in that landscape.
Can you re-explain that last bit which you just said so that I can maybe understand a little bit easier?
Yeah, for sure. And I'm no expert on pool technologies. I just follow it as, somebody who's obviously interested in Bitcoin security.
Yeah.
But kind of the traditional model for pools was you point your ASIC to them, and they basically just give you opaque data that you feed to your miner, and it does a bunch of hashes and tries to find a share. And then if it finds, a hash that falls under the target, then it sends that share back to the pool, and the pool credits you with points. The new mining technology gives miners more control over, well, so to take a step back, so that old technology, the pool could basically send whatever they want you to mine on, and your ASIC will just mine on top of it. So they could even send you, in some cases, blocks from other SHA-256 networks that aren't even Bitcoin. And people would quickly figure out that's what's going on, but that gives the pool the power to really direct that hash rate and like fully control it. Whereas with these new pool technologies, the pool is acting as more of just a coordinator, and the miners themselves have more control over what Bitcoin block they're building, making sure that's a Bitcoin block that's building on the canonical Bitcoin chain, having some control over what transactions go into that block to alleviate some of the potential, censorship concerns when you had the pools saying, here's the list of transactions in the block we want our miners to try to work on, giving the miners the ability to manipulate that transaction list if they want to. Technologies like that give more power back to the individual miners and make it harder for the pool to do things that are either malicious towards the Bitcoin protocol or malicious towards the miners on their pool.
Oh, good. Okay, so it's not like this problem is not being tackled or known of very well, by the whole industry, mining industry. So for judging from the way you're speaking, actually, I had a question here on asking you like what is sort of the risk behind a collusion somewhere in the future between 25, 2030. But from the way you're speaking, it's like it's organizing itself to be more decentralized.
I think it is, and I think that trend will continue. I think the mining decentralization is, there's a couple different layers to it. So there's who's actually running, the mining machines that are doing the calculations, and then who's coordinating them, a lot, who are the pools, what's the balance of power between them. And I think the current direction that everything there's moving is towards, giving more power to the individual miners running the machines, which is a better design. It makes Bitcoin more resilient. And I think there's also, and we've seen this played in the past, a sort of self-balancing where miners don't want to mine on a pool that has, close to 51% of the Bitcoin network hash rate. They do tend to naturally migrate to smaller pools. And there are, it's a hard thing for the Bitcoin protocol to directly incentivize. And so there's not really any protocol level solutions to miner decentralization, but it seems like there's relatively good social solutions in what the miners, choose to, what behaviors the miners running the actual hardware choose to vote for, if that makes sense.
Yes. So basically, the game theory behind the miners all working together here is just baked into the Bitcoin protocol, no?
Yep,
And
yeah, and it seems to
that's why
be
you can
playing out.
trust maybe that there won't be bad actors at the top, let's say, of the mining industry.
Yeah, fundamentally, the miners running the machines want more control, so they're going to point their hash rate to pools that give them more control or pose less risk to Bitcoin. A lot of the Bitcoin miners also hold a lot of Bitcoin reserves, and so in a lot of senses, doing anything malicious towards Bitcoin would be very expensive to them. People like to look at proof of work from the perspective of what would it cost to rent 51% of the network hash rate for an hour to perform an attack. And that kind of analysis works on smaller proof of work chains, which is why, on a smaller independent chain, proof of work is probably not the best idea. But when you get to the scale of Bitcoin, where it really is the only game in town and all of the participants are highly incentivized around Bitcoin continuing to be seen as secure, not having, attacks performed against the protocol, the incentive alignment naturally trends towards miners behaving in the best interest of the protocol. That doesn't mean a state actor couldn't theoretically, like I said, take over TSMC with, tanks and missiles and airplanes and print a bunch of ASIC chips and, attack the protocol as one independent actor. But with the current balance of hash rate and how Bitcoin miners themselves who are incentivized by the protocol, not incentivized like as a nation state to attack Bitcoin, the incentives seem to fall out where they are incentive aligned with Bitcoin's best interests.
Okay. As we move on now, can you see government regulation getting involved in mining pools?
I think we will see. I mean, we've already seen a little bit of that.
And would you agree with that, or would you rather the government stay out of this?
I think, I mean, personally, I always like the protocol to govern itself and, let the code, code is law in the sense of maybe not the absolutist. If there's a bug, you can't fix it, and that's just what it is. But my preference would be to have the protocols govern themselves. I think government involvement to some extent is basically inevitable, and we've seen it be more effective with proof of stake than proof of work. But I wouldn't be surprised to see more pushes towards some form of government control over, say, for example, transaction censorship, telling miners who operate in their country, you can't process any blocks that allow Bitcoin to be sent to or from this list of sanctioned addresses or whatever. It's very much a cat and mouse game, and there's also a kind of counter pressure to that where Bitcoin miners are not going to want to set up shop in a country where they are heavily regulated
Exactly.
because,
Yeah.
if so we've seen Bitcoin mining power move to where it's wanted in some sense, right? And there's still a lot of mining power in China, even though I believe the latest is China still banned mining. It seems to go back and forth, and who knows what the current status is there. And the written law is different than the enforced law, but in general, the incentives should work out where miners choose to deploy, obviously where there's cheap electricity and reliable internet, but also where they're not burdened by regulations that eat into their profit margin or create legal liability for them. And with a
Yeah.
proof of stake protocol, you have entities that are identified by on-chain asset actions that can be traced and figured out. And the same is relevant, it applies to Bitcoin, but it's not quite as strong. You can take your miners and start mining to a new address, and it's basically impossible to correlate that with your old address, right? And whether that's good or bad, you can argue from a, a law enforcement perspective, but certainly from a mining decentralization perspective, proof of work is more resilient to any sort of, state actor interference, but definitely not, completely immune
Immune.
to it.
Definitely
Yeah.
not immune to it. Exactly. So it's like a constant awareness, no, that we have to keep working on the decentralized aspect of it, Bitcoin.
Yeah, and also the interesting thing too now is with Bitcoin L2 starting to, launch into mainnet and be usable, if not maybe today, certainly in the next, couple of months.
What's this? What's this? I
Uh,
missed what you said is coming out in
so
it.
Bitcoin L2s, so L2
Yeah,
networks on Bitcoin.
like
That
like like lightning or
Lightning's one example of kind of Lightning is an L2 in some sense, but it's a L2 protocol where I'm more referring to like L2 blockchains, but Lightning is also relevant to this discussion too. But L2, kind of like on Ethereum, how you have optimism and base and arbitrum and so on and so forth, and they basically run their own blockchains on top of Ethereum. We're seeing the same thing happen in Bitcoin. Like that's what we're working on with Hemi is a Bitcoin L2. It's both Bitcoin and an Ethereum L2, but my point being that in the Bitcoin space, this development of Bitcoin L2s also serves as an additional anti-censorship layer because even if Bitcoin miners were, held at gunpoint and forced to censor transactions on the Bitcoin main chain,
yeah,
they can't
exactly.
control what happens on those Bitcoin L2s. Or the amount of control they have depends on the L2's design, but there's a lot of L2 designs where the Bitcoin miners, despite being, in complete control over what goes into their Bitcoin block, they don't control what happens on a Bitcoin L2, and it'd be, unrealistic or impossible to stop those Bitcoin miners from processing anything related to the L2. And so it provides this kind of a side system where you can sidestep Bitcoin miner censorship if it ever does exist, and do things with Bitcoin and Bitcoin-based assets under a different trust model. And generally, Bitcoin is the golden standard of censorship resistance. So I think generally in most cases, it would really go the other way. You'd say, the Bitcoin-based protocol is extremely censorship resistant, and these L2s are maybe more subject to censorship, but they're cheaper and faster and whatever.
So
But if Bitcoin,
that's the aim, no, with this L2 that you're building now. The aim is just to is scalability.
a couple of different names. So, and I'll close it on the censorship piece, and
Yeah.
then talk about how that kind of plays into what we're building. So on the censorship side, Bitcoin is kind of the gold standard of anti-censorship. And so like part of our protocol's design is we inherit anti-censorship properties from Bitcoin, meaning if there were to be censorship on our network through our sequencers or on the Ethereum network, then people could broadcast transactions through Bitcoin and still use that to interact with the L2. But you can also flip it around. If Bitcoin censorship were to become a thing, but from Bitcoin miners, then Bitcoin L2s would provide a different trust model where that censorship, it wouldn't be enforceable through the same parties. You'd have to go after the block producers of that Bitcoin L2 instead of Bitcoin itself.
Exactly. So before you said if you held the miner at gunpoint, so let's say you hold three of them at gunpoint and they all have 20% each. So now you're over the 51%. Then technically they can censor every single transaction and they can just stop the network, no?
They can essentially stop the network. So they could censor, what they do is they would say you wanted to censor all Bitcoin transactions,
Exactly.
and yeah, the three
Shut it
biggest
down
miners,
essentially.
yeah, what you could do is those migrate somewhere else because attacking
Okay.
Bitcoin, the miners don't want Bitcoin to be attacked because a lot of them are holders of Bitcoin, but also those miners are no longer earning fees because
And
those
then the
pools are
network
not
is back
collecting
up.
fees from, presumably, yeah. So it's never if you went to the actual data centers where the ASICs are being run and held those people at gunpoint, which is a lot harder to do, that's a
It's not
different
possible
story.
then. Yeah.
But going after the pools, you might be able to convince them, and it depends again on what technologies the pool's using and how much control they maintain versus give to the miners. And I think that's evolving towards being more resilient.
Good.
But if you were to go to the three major pools, hold them at gunpoint, you could probably get them to do, theoretically, a short-term 51% attack, but then the mining power is going to migrate to other pools that aren't being held at gunpoint. So
James
It's an interesting
D'Angelo.
dynamic, and hopefully we never actually see it play out.
No,
But
exactly. But my basically studying the 51% attack led me to down this very dark rabbit hole in Bitcoin, where I was like, okay, if they're held at gunpoint and they can shut down the network, that's it. It's been killed off. But the counter to that threat is that the pools, which is a bunch of people pushing hashing power to the block, the main block, like main miner, those will leave the pool, you're saying, and then automatically, slowly, the weight in Bitcoin mining will start to reduce, and then
yep,
basically it
exactly.
could reorganize again.
Yep, that's probably what we'd see play out. It would
I'm
be
sure
obviously
that's what will
damaging
play out
Bitcoin.
because
And
they're
this is an
outnumbered.
interesting, yeah, exactly. And this is an interesting difference between proof of work and proof of stake, because on proof of stake, you don't have miners that can go somewhere else, right? You are, if you were to attack a
Exactly.
proof of stake protocol, you've compromised the actual miners who are producing the blocks, who are, they can't take their Ethereum and go somewhere else because they're the ones you're holding at gunpoint, right? Versus Bitcoin, the control points, it's like you cut off the head and two heads grow back. If you attack the
Exactly.
pools, the miners still own the hardware and they can direct it somewhere else. And there's obviously nuance in there, but
It's like a coral reef. You cannot kill the entire habitat, but you can kill a part of the coral, and
yep,
then
yeah,
just and
exactly.
then just it will just regrow back. So then why? So you're working on Ethereum as well, but why do you work on Ethereum then if the main proof of stake doesn't really make sense? No, I mean from the way you're speaking, it doesn't really make sense.
I'll say so I'm a Bitcoin maximalist in the sense of if I were to choose one blockchain network that I think has, the most value to humanity, it would be Bitcoin. But that being said, there's things Bitcoin does well and there's things Ethereum does well. And Ethereum still has a ton of value and is still a great network for all kinds of different things that Bitcoin either can't do, doesn't have the scalability for, doesn't have the infrastructure for. And so the real win is, back in and you still see this today, but it's kind of dying down. You had, absolutists who said, I'm Bitcoin only. You also had Ethereum maximalists, although maybe they were a little less vehement about it. But we're seeing now, there's hundreds of blockchains, there's thousands of DeFi protocols, there's thousands of tokens, and people have, I think, generally gotten comfortable with the idea that you can have different networks do different things for different reasons with different trade-offs, and that actually builds a better overall ecosystem. And so when you look at crypto, the two main players are, and probably will continue to be for a long time, Bitcoin and Ethereum. And Bitcoin does security really well. Bitcoin does anti-censorship really, really well. And Bitcoin has, very stable, trustworthy protocol. But Ethereum has a lot of functionality that you can't get on Bitcoin, or at least not directly on Bitcoin. Ethereum has a much more diverse pool of other types of assets, between stable coins and, everything you can do in DeFi, all the composability. And actually, funny note, the
They
original,
have the DAI, no? The DAI stablecoin.
yep, DAI, USDC, USDT. What's actually interesting is USDT, everyone thinks about it as Ethereum native. I believe USDT actually started on Bitcoin back in the day using the colored coins meta protocol, but they had to move to Ethereum because Bitcoin wasn't really practical as a stablecoin settlement system.
This is Tether.
I'm pretty sure it's Tether. Don't quote me on
So
that, but I believe
I
Tether
won't.
launched on
But
Bitcoin first.
Tether is built on Ethereum, you're saying?
Tether right now, Tether is largely on Ethereum. They're also on other networks. I
Wow.
believe they have a lot of traffic on the Tron network
Wow,
and
I
a lot
didn't
of
know.
assets over there. But I'm pretty sure Tether originally launched on Bitcoin before it was ever on Ethereum.
Then my question is, how can it launch on Bitcoin? Because the way I understand it is, Ethereum is like the Android or the one of Apple. So like you can build applications on it. So, but you cannot do that with Bitcoin. So how can you build an application on Bitcoin?
So that's generally true, but there are ways to build limited protocols on Bitcoin. So at kind of a high level, Ethereum is a Turing complete programming environment. So anything that can be computable by a circuit, you can do on Ethereum, obviously subject to like, computational limits and such. But on Bitcoin, it's a lot more limited. But Bitcoin does have some functionality, some smart contract functionality. It's just not Turing complete. It's not as expressive, and it's a lot harder to use. And I believe it's Tether, but whatever stablecoin was the one that launched first on Bitcoin, there is a protocol on Bitcoin way back in the day. I forgot when exactly it started, but 2012, 2013, called Color Coins, and there was another similar protocol called Mastercoin that became OmniLayer.
Namecoin, maybe.
Namecoin was a separate blockchain, so that was a fork of the Bitcoin code, and so they forked the entire blockchain and spun up their own separate chain. But and then there was a OmniLayer counterparty colored coins. So there were these we call them meta protocols, and they're basically protocols that are embedded in Bitcoin. Either they use Bitcoin as their data layer, or they might be more tightly integrated into Bitcoin's UTXO model. But basically, you can build these kind of simple systems that they're clunky, they're hard to use, they're expensive to use, but they can do some stuff like mint an asset and track it being transferred around the Bitcoin network. And the Bitcoin network is completely unaware this exists. It's just kind of a layer built on top of Bitcoin. It's kind of like, and this is a gross oversimplification, but say for example, you and I had a spreadsheet and we were, every time we go hang out, one of us treats for dinner and puts it in the spreadsheet, and we use that to keep track of like, who's paid more or less or whatever. Or, and at the end of the day, hey, I'll pay for 2 meals in a row because you bought the expensive one, right? So say we had a ledger like that, we could take that ledger and publish it on Bitcoin as data. And then we could, we're running our own protocol that we've agreed upon between us for how that ledger gets updated and what the rules of it are. But we can trust that that ledger is, we're looking at the official version of the ledger because we put it on Bitcoin. And Bitcoin doesn't know that's happening. We're just publishing that spreadsheet to Bitcoin in a sense. So again, oversimplification, but there's stuff you can do like that. So you could basically launch a token on Bitcoin using one of those meta protocols that embedded data in Bitcoin that represented the transfer of that stablecoin around in a way that wasn't, integrated into the Bitcoin protocol, but did ride on the Bitcoin chain. And more recently with, and I'll keep this part short, but with like TapScript enabled basically embedding a lot bigger chunks of data into the Bitcoin blockchain than previously. Previously, it was, you could embed 80 bytes in an op return, and there were some other hacks to fit a little bit more into Bitcoin, but that was kind of it. Now you can embed kilobytes, hundreds of kilobytes, even megabytes into Bitcoin. And so that opens up, the design space for meta protocols a bit more, but they're still separated from Bitcoin. They ride on top of Bitcoin, but they're just using Bitcoin as kind of a data layer, not as, a cohesive ecosystem the same way Ethereum is. And so what we're doing with Hemi is we're trying to bridge that gap. So we're saying Bitcoin has, obviously the world's most valuable asset by market cap. It also has a lot of these assets riding on its meta protocols, BRC20s, runes, ordinals that have, value because they do live on Bitcoin in some way. And then Ethereum has all this programmability and these cool features and this composability. How do we combine those two together and take the best parts of both and create one ecosystem where you can bring Bitcoin assets in, you can bring Ethereum assets in, you can do Ethereum style stuff with Bitcoin assets, you can create applications that interact with the Bitcoin blockchain in interesting ways that you can't do natively on Bitcoin. And so that's the white space between those two chains that we're trying to solve and basically blend them together in a useful way.
Basically rebuilding everything we have today, but digitally and much better.
Yep, basically taking lessons learned from, okay, Bitcoin ultimate security, let's use that. Ethereum great programmability, let's use that. Okay, how do we interact with the Bitcoin and Ethereum networks in a common way that's compatible, and you can write applications that leverage both systems of connectivity. And and then we use Ethereum for DA because Ethereum's really good at serving as the DA layer. So kind of mixing and matching features from the networks in a way that at least we hope creates a some
Serves
whose
whatever
value
you
is
need
greater
it to
than.
serve, I guess.
Yep, that is the goal.
Yeah. I have only two more questions left, so I won't keep you for much longer. But in 2017, when we had the, let's say, culture war with Segwit, um, it went one way, it went the small block way, which was the correct way to go. But is there another culture war on the horizon? Is there infighting about certain things that, for example, privacy. Why is it that when someone sees the address that you send, why is it that someone on Bitcoin can see the full wallet holdings? Why can't there ever be a soft fork on that so that that's no longer existing? So my question is basically, that's just an example. My question is, do you foresee any future soft forks or hard fork debates about anything?
Absolutely, and there's actually some going on now. So
Absolutely.
absolutely, yeah, and I say that because there's ones happening right now. So
Okay, interesting.
they're less public than the SegWit one for sure. But like right now, there's two things, at least from uh, conversations I've seen and what
Yeah.
seems to get attention. There's kind of two main ones at the moment, and there's probably 50 other smaller ones, but and the privacy one you mentioned is one of those smaller ones as well, and that's going to be an ongoing thread until either that functionality does get added or it's just going to go on forever.
I mean, if it
And
gets added, it can be removed the next day, no?
that's the tricky thing is once you add something to the protocol, you're basically stuck supporting it forever in some sense. Like
Why
networks
can't you
have
remove it?
removed because people start using it. And so if you were to remove it, anyone who's actively using it, you'd break what they built on it. So like say, for example, you added
Ah,
some sort of like shielded transaction to Bitcoin, and then I go and I, shield my Bitcoin and I do some transactions. And again, talking in generalities, and there are ways to like spin down a protocol or part of a protocol, but in general, if we were using that system and then Bitcoin, yeah, did a fork to remove it, then the stuff we were doing, the Bitcoin that we locked into that system could be lost. There'd need to be a process to pull it out. Generally speaking, protocols don't remove features. I can't think of a counterexample, but I'm sure there are protocols that have removed like a feature that they realized was a bad idea. But in general, once you add it, people start building on top of it. And so
and it
if you
makes
rip it
sense.
out, it causes a bunch of issues. Yeah.
So that's why you're saying that if we decide to do it, we must stick with it.
Yep. And also the way that soft forks are activated specifically, and this is kind of a Bitcoin specific problem, but there are certain kinds of things that you can activate by, adding functionality in a way that basically makes Bitcoin miners, uh, how do I put this? They basically reject transactions they would have previously accepted. And by doing that, you introduce a feature like, for example, SegWit.
Why
With
would they do
SegWit,
that though?
well, when you do the protocol upgrade, basically the miners agree to. So the way a soft fork works at a high level is you basically say, hey, this thing on Bitcoin that we're not using, as in, anyone who, for example, with SegWit, there was I may get one of the details wrong here, but there's basically you can think of it like there was network features that you could use, but they didn't do anything, or you could, in the SegWit case, like you could build a transaction. So the way Bitcoin's UTXO model works is you could send money to a person, like a private key, but you could also send money to a math problem. And so you could send money to anyone who can answer the question 4 plus 5 equals X. And anyone who says 9 gets to claim that Bitcoin. And so that kind of a construct, you can send coins in ways that normally anyone would be able to claim. But if the miners agree to activate a soft fork, they all agree to not accept those transactions unless they meet an additional threshold. So for example, the way SegWit was activated was they said, let's send transactions in a way that normally anyone could go and claim, but the miners are going to start enforcing more rules on that validation. And that's where we're going to slip into SegWit features. So it'd be like saying, we're going to use that 4 plus 5 equals 9 problem, but miners will only include a transaction that produces the correct answer 9 if they also attach a signature in this other way that Bitcoin is not familiar with. And that makes it backwards compatible because the old clients on the network will just see 4 plus 5 equals 9 and say, yep, that transaction's valid. But the miners who control it actually gets into the blocks would say, oh, but you answered the 4 plus 5 equals 9 question, but you didn't provide this other signature that we're now requiring to do that type of transaction. So we're not going to include it. And so that's a way you can activate. It sounds like kind of a hack, and it is to some extent, but that's a way you can activate new features where miners start enforcing new rules, but it's done in a way that's backwards compatible because the old participants just see the old rules. But when you then remove one of those rules, like say you were to deactivate SegWit, all the funds in SegWit addresses could be stolen because you're deactivating that extra agreement between miners to not include those transactions that's enforced through that soft fork. A
I
bit of a
see.
simplification, but if that makes sense. So
No, it
sometimes it's
makes a
easier
lot
to
of
activate
sense.
stuff
No,
than
it
to remove
makes
it too.
you're making a lot of sense. Like I'm really enjoying asking you these questions. So what are the two risks you said are currently being spoken about a bit vocally?
The two big debates. So one of them you might have this one's gets a lot of attention on Twitter is called OpCat. So uh, in summary, basically the way so Bitcoin has its own smart contract language, like I said, but it's not Turing complete, and it basically has this small set of opcodes that can do stuff like they can hash some data, they can add numbers together, they can check signatures, but you can't do stuff like you can't do a for loop, right? Or you don't have like flow control. You don't and a lot of common things that would seem like it shouldn't be a problem, like say multiplying a number or whatever, either aren't allowed or they work in really weird limited ways. And so there was originally one of those opcodes in the Bitcoin scripting language that Satoshi put in back when he created Bitcoin called opcat, opcode concatenate, which basically takes two chunks of data and shoves them together. And so like say you had, if in programming, if you had a string, Max and then a string Sanchez, and you concatenate them, you get Max Sanchez as one string, right?
Sanchez
You're just
is one
smashing
string.
data together. And Satoshi disabled that opcode because there was a vulnerability in it way, way, way back in like 2010, where you could use that to basically grow these really large items in memory that were seen as a denial of service issue for the protocol or overflowed some bounds and caused some unexpected behavior. So it was deactivated, but it's a really useful opcode for some of the stuff people are trying to do on Bitcoin nowadays. So like if you've heard of BitVM, which is a way to essentially verify ZK proofs, zero knowledge proofs on Bitcoin. They're not really zero knowledge, they're succinct arguments of knowledge, but everyone calls them ZK proofs. But verify those in Bitcoin. And one of the things that makes doing that a lot easier is being able to concatenate data together. And without that opcode, there's ways to do it with the existing opcodes, but it's extremely expensive and cumbersome. So people are trying to get opcat reactivated. And I think the total number of lines of Bitcoin that would change is like 20 lines of the core protocol or something less than that to reactivate it.
Even a
And
letter sounds like a lot.
yeah,
A
exactly. In
letter
the
sounds
Bitcoin world,
like
that's a
it could
lot.
be error.
Exactly. And that's what the debate is. And I don't know how long that's been going on. It's been, gosh, probably 2 years at this point,
So that's
maybe
one.
more.
So that's one topic,
So that's one
one
of them. And then
debate.
the other one is adding a opcode for verifying ZK proofs. And so people want to use opcat to be able to build ZK verifiers in Bitcoin script.
The
And people
ZK
also
is
want
zero knowledge, right?
zero knowledge. Yeah. So being able to verify like and not to be overly pedantic, I say as I'm probably overly pedantic, but everyone talks about ZK proofs, but in most blockchain applications, the ZK part we actually don't care about. What we care about is the succinct argument of knowledge. So being able to prove that something's true. The zero knowledge just means that by producing the proof, I don't reveal anything about the input data. Generally, in the blockchain world, the input data is already public. You don't care about zero knowledge over it. ZK only really applies to like privacy applications. So when people talk about ZK for interoperability, like building Bitcoin L2s, they actually don't care about the ZK part. They care about something that happens to come with the ZK part, which is the argument that something is true.
So
Um,
ZK is like I bought something, but I didn't get a receipt for it.
you can think of ZK as like, well, so the kind of classic example is say you're colorblind, but I can see color.
Uh-huh.
I could prove to you that I can see color, or at least something that differentiates two objects that I say are colored differently, but you can't tell are colored differently
And that
by
happens on Bitcoin.
Uh, in a sense, this is like an example of what zero knowledge
Okay.
means, but you can apply the same thing to like computations. But so for me to prove to you that I actually can see color, we can engage in an interactive process where basically you mix up the balls behind your back so I can't see them, and you remember how you mix them, and then you show them to me, and I tell you which ones, the orange. I claim one's orange, one's blue, and I can always identify the orange one. And the fact that you were able to mix them, and I was always able to point to the orange one, and you only know that's what I consider orange because you remember
That you
how
told
you
me that.
shuffled them, that proves to you that I can see color. But I didn't prove to you, I didn't tell you, I used the orange and blue in this example, but I could do it without telling you they're orange and blue and just that they're different colors. And so that'd be
Exactly.
a zero knowledge proof that they're colored differently without telling you what color they are. So that zero knowledge is that not revealing the color, but proving that I know the colors are different. And when you apply that to the blockchain ecosystem, that means you can build protocols like I sent you money and I can prove that I was allowed to send you that money, but I don't reveal where it was from. And that's kind of a simplification, but like that's how things like Zcash work, is they use zero knowledge proofs to basically ensure the solvency of the system without being, so like Bitcoin, everything's public, like you said earlier. So you see, address A sent 2 Bitcoin to address B, and then address B sent those 2 Bitcoin to address C. With an actual zero knowledge protocol, you can do stuff where you don't know my balance and the protocol doesn't know my balance, but I can prove to you that I was allowed to spend 2 Bitcoin because I've received 2 or more Bitcoin at some point in the past. And so that zero knowledge proof is basically used as a way for me to not reveal, for the protocol not to have to track who owns what, but for the individual users to be able to prove that they're authorized to spend a certain amount of the tokens and transfer them to somebody else. So
So
basically it lets you,
this is the second debate right now.
this is the second debate. And so
It's a good debate, though.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm not sure where it's going to end up because this is a much bigger addition to the protocol than Opcat. Like Opcat, 20 lines of code that are changed or less. And it's something that was already in Bitcoin and then removed at one point, and we're just
I'm
adding it
more
back
inclined
in.
to say I don't. Thing is, I have no opinion. Actually, I'm just listening. Sorry.
Yeah, but the ZK side, so if we do get a ZK verifier, so what I was saying on the ZK proof side is that's like actual zero knowledge where zero knowledge matters, is like that privacy application. But there's also a benefit of ZK proofs, that is that they are succinct, meaning that I could prove to you that I know the color of 100,000 balls, but I could do that in linear time or even constant time, meaning that whether there's 1,000 balls or 10,000 balls, I could prove I know the difference between all of them without having to scale the communication between us, or like how long it takes for me to prove it to you with the number of balls that there are. And
And
that
what's
part's
yeah,
useful
sorry.
because you can use it for cross-chain stuff. So you can basically prove to Bitcoin, the Ethereum blockchain is, terabytes in size, but I could prove to you that a certain transaction does not exist in Ethereum, for example, kind of a contrived example, but I could prove that a transaction does not exist in Ethereum with a proof that I could send you as, an attachment to an email. And so that succinctness, it allows me to prove that a statement's true without, the zero knowledge, because I didn't have to give you the whole Ethereum blockchain, but the part we care about is just that, you have access to the Ethereum blockchain, it's public, you just don't want to download it. And so this succinctness is what we care about. And so on Bitcoin, the main interest in the quote unquote, ZK verifier is really being able to verify those proofs because they're succinct proofs of remote execution, basically. So you could prove the state of a Bitcoin L2, anything about it, without Bitcoin having to actually be aware of that L2 protocol. And so that would let us build more robust applications on top of Bitcoin that can basically succinctly verify any arbitrary claim about a remote blockchain in Bitcoin very efficiently without needing all the data of that remote chain.
So if you were to reduce the second argument into one argument for it and one argument against it, what would you get? What would you say?
The argument for it is definitely uh, giving Bitcoin more features and primarily enabling scalability technologies that are easier to build and also cheaper to run and have better trust models, better security than the way that we can do it today with BitVM is an amazing innovation and there's a ton of cool stuff we can do with it, but it's not quite the same as like actually just having Bitcoin verify the ZK proof. So that's the pro. The con is it adds complexity to the protocol, and anytime you do that, there is risk.
I
And
know.
that's pretty much the argument against any upgrade to Bitcoin. Some upgrades,
It's a big argument. It's a big worry.
it is, yeah, especially in the Bitcoin world, and for good reason. And some upgrades, they pose additional risks. Like people have argued over doing some sort of like covenant system on Bitcoin, which basically means, Bitcoin, if I send my 1 Bitcoin to you, you can do whatever you want with it today. But if we had a covenant system, and I think there's like 20 different proposed designs for covenant systems now, but I could encumber that Bitcoin I send to you in some way where I could say you can only spend it once you can only spend it if you send it to one of these 3 people. And you can do recursive covenants. So say you can only send it to one of these 3 people if they can only send it back to you or one of the other people in that group. And there's already some ways to simulate covenants and stuff on Bitcoin, but ignoring that, people want a feature that's native to the Bitcoin protocol that allows more robust covenant enforcement. And there's actually a way with Opcat to do some sort of covenant system too. And people argue that if you were to add that feature to the Bitcoin protocol, then governments would be able to force institutions like exchanges to enforce recursive covenants on withdrawals, and thereby basically force a KYC whitelist into the Bitcoin ecosystem. I don't think that's a realistic concern, but it is another concern that people have over some types of upgrades.
Because now they've given this privacy feature.
For some of the features. So there's some stuff with ZK proofs that could theoretically enforce covenants, but that's probably less of a concern, although still a concern. Sorry, I was jumping around. I jumped back to OpCat and some of the other smaller proposals. Some of them, there's the risk to the protocol, with any change, but there's also that risk of, just to give an example of like that risk of covenants being used by, a government actor to enforce whitelists on Bitcoin, which I think is overblown and being overly dramatic, but that is another valid concern for some of these upgrades. And with ZK proofs, there is theoretically a way where you could, with OpCat and ZK proofs, I believe you could enforce arbitrary covenants by enforcing a certain type of covenant on a ZK proof that proves that you locked Bitcoin in a certain way on the network before it's redeemed, but you have to front liquidity. And there's a lot of other weird complexities, and I'm not an expert on that, but definitely
Michael
the covenant
Saylor
stuff's
says,
a
Michael Saylor says,
concern.
don't touch anything.
There's a lot of people in Bitcoin that take that approach, and it's not completely unreasonable.
Exactly. I mean, okay, I have just one more question to ask. I can't remember how I had come to this question because I don't know if it's a topic, but it's here. Um, is there any debate or discussion maybe that we can improve decentralization or encourage solo mining by reducing the block size even smaller?
Um, it's definitely like from a academic perspective, it's definitely true. Like the smaller you make the blocks, the easier they are for people on the network to receive quickly. And one of the, if you go to the other extreme, say we let Bitcoin have 10 terabyte blocks, only a very select few people could actually mine those blocks. And even between those people, the one who mines one block would have an advantage over the other ones because those other ones have to wait to download and process that 10 terabytes before they can start mining the next block. And so there is definitely an argument for lowering the Bitcoin block size to increase decentralization. I think the current 4 megabyte blocks are, if we reduce it to a half a megabyte, would we theoretically get more decentralization? Yes, but I think we're at the point where it's such diminishing returns that it wouldn't really be worth it.
Mm.
We can argue whether increasing it from 4 to 8 is a good idea or
But
leaving it at 4 is a
wasn't
good
it one?
idea.
Isn't it one? It wasn't the whole debate of 2017, 1 megabyte versus two.
Uh, there's some nuance. So they kept the Bitcoin block size at 1 megabyte. There was I forgot what I'm trying to remember some of my Bitcoin history trivia now. There was so the way they ended up implementing it, I can talk to the technical, like what actually happened. So the way they implemented it was they kept the Bitcoin block size at 1 megabyte, but they added a up to 3 megabyte sidecar that goes with that block. And so it's like an attachment. It'd be like saying the body of an email can only be 100 kilobytes, but you can now attach another 300 kilobytes to that email, right? So the email, technically the body's still 100 kilobytes, but now there's more data coming with it. And so the way that the compromise in some sense that everyone came to when SegWit was activated was adding that sidecar. So nodes could still just download that 1 megabyte block, which is important. And so there was benefit to separating it to that 1 megabyte block, 3 megabyte sidecar, because you could just download that 1 megabyte block. You could assume the SegWit stuff is true, and then you could start building another block on top of it. But if the SegWit data wasn't true, then you're going to produce a block that all the other miners reject because you didn't correctly invalidate a block based on SegWit attachment. So it's a nuance, but effectively the Bitcoin block size is now 4 megabytes, because any miner who wants to be running a Bitcoin full node realistically does have to download that sidecar.
Okay, interesting, very interesting. That actually clears up something which I always said because it's on the mempool now. You can see the size of the blocks.
Yep, yeah, and actually if
And
you go
I
to mempool, that's
and I
fixed
would
right
see
now,
them
you'll see.
3.8, 3 point this. I'm like, but 3.8, wasn't it meant to be
Yep, yeah,
one?
that's exactly what it is. It's the block plus its SegWit sidecar. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you
Yeah,
so much.
likewise.
I just want to finish with one question I have to ask. Since you've gone through every single cycle, including 2012, what's the feel for the future with the Bitcoin price for you? And then as a final question, what are you focusing on moving forward?
So on the price question, I'll say if I could predict that, I'd be a lot richer. So I mean, given just historical, like, assuming patterns repeat, we always have a bull run and we make higher highs, and then there's a drop of, and I don't even watch the markets that closely, but what, 50 to 70%,
Yeah.
and then it takes a year and a half, and then the bull run starts again. So if I had to make a educated guess, I think it's probably gonna make, new. I think we may have actually technically made an all-time high recently, but I think it's gonna make like, significant all-time highs in this bull cycle before, I'm sure inevitably we'll have a correction as always happens. But we are getting to the point where I don't think we're there yet, but I don't know for sure where, Bitcoin grows to such a size where that previous cycle pattern stops, right? It gets big
Uh,
enough where it
that's
can't
the
go
big
up
question,
4x
no?
and
That's the
then
big question.
yeah, and it's tricky. And also there's a lot of weird forces. Like you have ETFs now for Bitcoin, and you can argue, and I think overall it was very positive for the industry, but it also does give a lot more control of the Bitcoin price to the traditional financial market. And there's now there's always been ways to short Bitcoin in some sense, but now it makes taking bets against Bitcoin's price easier. There's potentially more, room for manipulation. I won't say whether it is or is not. I don't know, and I'm not an expert on that, but that's definitely, relevant. And this is the first cycle we went through with ETFs, so that's going to be interesting. But yeah, hard to know, but I'm definitely hopeful personally. And then for the second question, what am I focused on? So I mean, obviously, Hemi and the technology we're building, as far as like what specifically that means, there's kind of three main things that at least I'm personally really excited about. So the first is the way we're building Hemi is we're building a new way of designing Bitcoin smart contracts. And we're doing it in a way that's familiar to Solidity developers. It's all backwards compatible with anything you do on Ethereum, but it basically gives your smart contract full visibility of the Bitcoin chain. So historically, if you wanted to build an application on Ethereum that did something in response to an event on Bitcoin, you were very limited in how you could do that, and it was expensive. You had to validate cryptographic proofs, and you could only prove a transaction does exist in Bitcoin. You couldn't look at like the UTXO table of Bitcoin or information, reliable information about Bitcoin fees and stuff like that. So the system we're building is basically a Bitcoin full node inside an EVM. And I think that that construct is going to enable people to build a lot of new non-custodial or trust minimized or trustless, depending on the type of application, but really robust applications that can interact with Bitcoin assets in ways that you can't do today, while leaving the Bitcoin assets on the Bitcoin native protocol with self-custody and whatnot. And I think there's great opportunities for that for cross-chain swapping, obviously, but there's been ways to do that with atomic swaps historically, but this is more robust. There's the ability to do native Bitcoin lending, so collateralizing a loan with ETH or USDC or USDT or whatever, and then borrow Bitcoin natively on the Bitcoin network, and then repay that loan natively on Bitcoin and get back your Ethereum collateral. So you can do fully trustless native Bitcoin lending. There's also cool stuff you can do with Bitcoin staking uh, with full self-custody. And so excited to see where that goes.
Would be
We're
great
really
to
focused
stake in a
on,
bear market.
yeah, exactly. Or in a bull market. You know what? The
Yes and no. Yes and no. Yes.
it
I
depends
mean,
how locked up you
something
are,
to
right?
stake is good, I guess. Something to
Yeah,
stake is
it
good, I
depends
guess.
on whether you're locking it up long term or have liquidity. But there's
So,
there's
so
even
you work
staking
with
protocols.
Babylon. You work with Babylon
We're not working with Babylon for we're kind of
because those are
there.
working on
There's
yields with your Bitcoin, as far as I know.
so there's a couple different approaches to Bitcoin staking, and we're taking kind of a anything. We're really trying to be an infrastructure play. and see what people build with the tools we give them. And so I'm not sure if this is public yet or not, but we're doing some stuff with Bitcoin restaked assets from the Ethereum ecosystem. Actually, we did announce one of those, so I know I can talk about that. So we're doing some stuff on the Hemi protocol that, like, we will have our own native Bitcoin that is bridged, or we call it tunneling, is tunneled over from Bitcoin to the Hemi network natively through our own infrastructure. But we're trying to cultivate an ecosystem for all the other Bitcoin assets that already exist in Ethereum. So we're kind of taking a, shotgun approach of, let's try to support all the different things happening on Bitcoin, all the different LSTs and LRTs, and see which ones win, see which ones lose, but create an ecosystem where you can do whatever you want with any of them, and really leave that up to the user. And so from that, we're kind of indirectly working with, or maybe working with protocols that basically create LST or LRT derivatives of Babylon staking. But we're not doing anything like natively on a protocol level with their staking system. If somebody were to build, Bitcoin staking on Hemi, it would be structured differently and would be using that HVM technology we're working on.
Really cool, huh? Really cool. Um, Max, I'll end it here. I think I have a lot to unpack with all this information. But I had a lot of questions which have been on my mind actually for a long time, because I'm listening to people obviously go on about Bitcoin, and now it's really nonstop. And then in my head I'm going, yeah, but then there's this whole issue with the mining, and but you've cleared it up for me that actually it's whilst it obviously presents a risk, the whole Bitcoin protocol is actually structured to protect itself against that risk quite robustly, actually.
It's worked so far.
Or it's worked so far, exactly. Or it's worked
And
so far.
I'm pretty confident that'll continue. But
I hope
yeah,
so.
absolutely great chatting with you. Really appreciate your time as well. And
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
always love to talk about Bitcoin. So anytime you
Yeah,
want
me
to,
too.
let me know.
And to speak with you was great help actually, because I got to ask a lot of very complex questions that you knew very well. So thank you for that.
Awesome. I'm glad it was helpful.
Cool.